Hi, everybody. It's Wednesday and it's Mrs. King, and I am here today to talk to you a little bit more about stories and what we call story structure. This week, we've been focusing on not just what a story is, but how it's set up, how it's laid out. And so I've got a short story that we're going to kind of read together and talk about that. It's what we call story structure. Mrs. Gannum has been kind of introducing some of that to you, and I'm here today with another example. As we know, stories come in different forms. We can read picture books. Sometimes they come in chapter books and also short passages. Those are three different types of text. A picture book, like what we've been reading for all of our read alouds, like the book about Sophie and the book Recess Queen, and all of those are picture books. Also, books like Third Grade Angels that we've read. This is a chapter book. It's set up a little bit differently. And then a short passage, and that's what I have for you today. We're going to talk about and read together. Stories are also separated and divided into chapters or paragraphs, depending on how long the story is. If it's a chapter book, then obviously then it's divided into chapters, and each chapter kind of builds on the next. For example, when we read chapter 1, that helps us to know kind of what is going to happen maybe in chapter 2 or 3 or towards the end of the book. Each chapter builds on each other. Same thing in a picture book. If we have a picture book, it doesn't necessarily have chapters, but it does have a story, maybe paragraphs, and each paragraph kind of builds to introduce the next one. We don't want to read a story out of order. It wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't follow that story pattern that we've mentioned with beginning, middle, and end. And so when we read short stories or chapter books, it's important to know how it's laid out using this story structure. And so today I have a story that we're going to read together, and we're going to talk about how it's laid out and a little bit about how we would understand it. Obviously, you're going to read this story a little differently than you would if you were reading a play or a poem or a nonfiction text. Those are all completely different. So this story today is called Toothbrush Games, and I'm going to read it. And as I'm reading it, I want you to kind of think about what you see or what you hear that we just kind of mentioned with story structure, the paragraphs, and how the story builds on each other. Toothbrush Games. Tim and Tina are twins that do everything together. Their mom called up to them from downstairs. She told them that their playtime had run out and that it was time for bed. They needed to get into the bathroom to brush their teeth and prepare for sleep. Tim and Tina absolutely hated going to bed because they would prefer to stay up and play together all day and night. Tim looked at Tina and said, "Let's have a contest. Let's see who can brush their teeth the absolute best. No plaque left on any tooth." Tim and Tina started scrubbing away. Leave it to these twins to turn nighttime responsibilities into a game. They set the timer for 2 minutes and both worked on flawlessly brushing every single tooth. After their timer went off, to alert them the contest was over, Tim and Tina took a sip of their magic mouthwash. This mouthwash showed plaque that was left on their teeth after they brushed. Once they spit out the mouthwash and flashed their teeth in the mirror, they counted Tim's 2 plaque spots and none for Tina. Tina had won the toothbrush games. So, short story, short passage is what I would call this. Let's look for a minute how this is structured. For example, I see that this story is set up using paragraphs. I know a paragraph is started with an indentation. We indent the first line. So here's a paragraph starting with the word Tim. As I keep going, here's paragraph number 2. Paragraph number 3 there. So it's set up with 3 paragraphs. Each one builds on each other. So, for example, when we read the first paragraph, that's what we would call the beginning because it talks about what they were doing at their home that night. It was time for bed. Their playtime was over. They were getting ready to brush their teeth. So that would be what we would call the beginning of the story. And we want to read that first. Otherwise, the middle of the story, all of this, wouldn't make sense. So that's what I would mean when I say that each paragraph builds on the one before it. The second paragraph helps us to understand because we've already read paragraph 1. So here's the middle of our story as we're kind of moving along in sequence. This one is about what their toothbrush games were about, what they had to do, and kind of how they got that going. I also see some dialogue. We know that dialogue is when characters in our story are talking. And so they talk. Tim mentions to Tina right about here, as I'm highlighting, where you see those quotation marks. He was doing some speaking there in the middle of our story. Okay, scrolling on down, paragraph 3 starts with the word after, and this is what I would call the end of the story. It kind of tells and summarizes what happens to kind of wrap up the toothbrush games that they were starting and how that ends, kind of the solution. We know that Tina ended up winning. But again, if we were to read this whole paragraph 3, what we find out in paragraph 3 kind of, again, is built from what we were introduced in paragraphs 1 and 2. They each kind of follow that sequence. So if we read paragraph 3 first, it just wouldn't make sense in our story structure. So that's what we mean when we are talking about how a story is laid out or structured. Again, this is going to be different depending on what type of passage or story you're reading. But since we have a fictional story, this is how it's laid out with beginning, middle, end, and our paragraphs. So I hope you learned something today about story structure and how a fictional story is designed.